welcome to the Sidewalk Ballet. I'm excited to have you on the podcast to talk about the future back in the past.
It's my pleasure. It feels like we're back in the past and the future at the same time having this conversation. My name is Feliks Banel. I've lived in Seattle my whole life, other than a couple of years on the East Coast when I was in my early 20s. My parents immigrated from Europe and came here in the 50s, and I am a historian and media person. I was a deputy director at the big history museum here in town for about 7 years. Worked at a commercial radio station for about a decade. I've done freelance stuff for a bunch of other radio stations and TV and everything. So my interest is in history and in connecting, because when I worked at the museum, it was always frustrating how few people could come through the door. That was our audience right there. And taking history and doing it via media, whether it's podcast or radio or TV, and the infinite possibility. Of course, you can be ignored by an infinite audience as well, but the potential of a much larger audience is so great for history and storytelling, and particularly audio. I don't think there's any better combinations of disciplines and media.
How did you come to that? Where did your interest in history spur? Have you always had that since you were young, or was there something that introduced you to the world of history?
I had older parents. I'm the youngest of 9 kids. My dad, I think, was 45 when I was born. My mom was 40. And they both survived World War II. My dad was a 16-year-old in Poland when the Nazis invaded. My mom was, I think, 11 when World War II started, where she lived in London, and she, lived through all the Blitz and everything. And so we always talked about history, because it was always, both my parents had been affected so deeply and personally by world history that we paid attention. We watched, 60 Minutes and watched the news and read the newspapers and always talked. It was always very present. It wasn't like a nostalgic thing. It was sort of it was survival. I think my dad listened to the radio all the time because he was convinced, the Soviets were going to attack at some point. So it's been a lifelong pursuit for me to understand what my parents experienced. I mean, I was just in Poland a week ago visiting, the ship that my dad used when he escaped from communist Poland. And I was in London earlier this year for the VE Day 80th anniversary, broadcasting from there for a local radio station. I just feel like that World War II history is so relevant today as we're seeing it being dismantled, all the benefits of that victory. And I feel like that story, it's so critical that we don't lose sight of that story, from, even though it's 80 years ago, and even though it's, most of the people who took part or witnessed it are gone. It's almost more important than the founding fathers' story, that story of what the U.S. did in World War II with our allies and what we did to create a new world that's crumbling before our eyes right now. So anyway, that's the short version of why I like history so much.
So you are in Seattle. Were you born there?
Yeah, I was born in a suburb. My parents moved. My dad worked for Boeing. They lived in the suburbs east of Seattle. So I live there now. I've lived in Seattle for the last 35 years.
So as everything is connected, right? And we learn that both studying history or really studying anything, biology, chemistry, all of it. Seattle is very connected to World War II. So when you talk about the history of the war, you talk about the history of that. And you mentioned your dad worked for Boeing. So draw me a little bit of a line to how Seattle plays a role, both in the history of and in the context of World War II, and I guess even pre and post-war America or world.
Yeah, well, the Boeing company was headquartered here from, I think, 1916 until 2002 when they uprooted the headquarters. But the aircraft that they developed here in the 1930s and 1940s that were used by the Allies, huge role in the B-17, critical to victory in Europe, B-29, critical to victory in the Pacific, delivering the atomic bomb and everything. But Boeing, the transformation of this area, the workforce that Boeing put together, beginning in the run-up to World War II in the late 1930s and all throughout World War II, completely transformed Seattle. The population grew hugely during World War II, people moving from other parts of the country for really, good-paying defense jobs. It's the first time that we really had housing shortages, that we kind of thing we're facing now as a modern 21st century city. Bob Hope came to Fort Lewis, which is an Army base south of Seattle, and he did a little monologue. This is like 1942, one of his wartime shows where he'd do them from military bases. And he said something like, I was walking down the street in Seattle, and I said, hey, where do I get a place to live? And the guy said, I don't know, don't ask me. I'm the mayor, and I live in Tacoma. So this big joke about how tough it was to find a place to live in Seattle. So the other thing that Boeing did was it trained a really very skilled workforce, kind of a middle class or blue collar workforce, paid very well, that after World War II, when the dawn of civil aviation, like jet jet travel and everything comes a few years later. A lot of well-paid people working manufacturing jobs, buying second homes, buying boats. It was a really high quality of life here and a very affordable place to live all throughout most of the 20th century. It really doesn't start to really turn into this kind of overpriced, kind of big city, big world city with world city problems until the 1990s or early 2000s. So Boeing really did transform the culture. And they used to say, if Boeing sneezes, Seattle catches cold. Back around 1970, when the next big thing was supersonic travel, the government had funded development of the SST, the supersonic transport, a Boeing jet that was huge, loud, consumed massive amounts of fuel, and it would get you across country in a couple hours. They pulled the plug on the funding, and Boeing went into a tailspin, literally, and laid off 2/3 of their workforce. And people were worried that Seattle was going to become a ghost town. But what they figured out was that all the people who had moved here from elsewhere to work at Boeing, when they lost their Boeing job, they didn't just uproot and go to Ohio or Florida. They liked it here. They liked the environment. They liked the Cascades, the rivers, the mountains. And they found ways to start their own businesses. And there's all these spin-offs of companies that were formed in the wake of the Boeing bust. Of course, it's much more diversified now when Microsoft comes along in the 80s and all the other technology that's followed since then. And Boeing, diversifying and moving their manufacturing to other parts of the country. It's a very different community than it was. But from, say, World War II up into the 1980s, Seattle and Boeing were, you couldn't, it was one and the same. They were, the different sides of the same coin.
So in the middle of that, kind of during the Cold War years, as Seattle is really coming into to be known as a global city, beyond just Boeing, we're in the Cold War era, and Seattle decides to host a little event in 1962. Actually decided to host it earlier, but it ended up in 62. So set that up for me. How did the decision to do a World Expo or World Fair in Seattle come about, and what was that moment in America?
Yeah, the 50s in Seattle that's kind of when the city that we know nowadays really is born, because Boeing leads the way with the development of a jetliner, the 707, which if you look at most jetliners nowadays, you can't tell them apart from a 707. Boeing kind of perfected the design. They did this brilliant thing where they, the prototype, which they called the Dash 80, it served as a prototype for the civilian jetliner as well as for a military tanker. And so they couldn't lose. They had one way or another, there was going to be successful as a jetliner or as a military tanker. It was successful as both. And it's just really, they bet the company, they went almost into debt to pull off this prototype. So Seattle's booming in the 1950s with the dawn of jet aviation. So for 1959, it's 50 years past when Seattle had its first World's Fair, one of these sort of 19th century style, though it was in 1909, Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition. Portland had one like that. San Francisco, San Diego, every kind of relatively big city had a World's Fair like that in the 19th century, early 20th century. And the AYP in Seattle was a big deal. I mean, they used it as a little bit of a foreshadow to what they did with the World's Fair in '62, which we'll talk about. They used the money to build out the fairgrounds for the 1909 fair on the very tiny University of Washington campus. And they built all these streets and buildings and things that once that fair was over, they reused them as classrooms and housing. I mean, really smart. Again, they did echo the same thing a few years later, 50 years later in 1962. So that idea grew to have that 1959 fair, and it got delayed. And the big thing that really, really shifted everything was Sputnik. October 4th, 1957. Also the same day that Leave It to Beaver premieres on ABC. Coincidentally. So Sputnik is a Soviet satellite that's circling around the Earth, and everyone's it's circling overhead of the United States. Everyone's paranoid. The Soviets are winning the space race. So the federal government is looking for opportunities to invest in technology and promoting American technology. And our congressional delegation figures out there's ways to get federal money to give a new boost, shot in the arm for this little tiny fair that's kind of starting to come together, starting to coalesce. And they get $12 million in 1957, which is a huge amount of money then. And I mean, enormous amount of money then. It's still, $12 million still sounds pretty big to me now. And that lets them build a United States Science Pavilion. And the fair, which had been sort of looking for a theme, I mean, it was still going to be this 50th anniversary thing for this Alaska Yukon Pacific Fair, but very backward looking fair, like 50 years. All of a sudden kind of morphs into this very futuristic fair about science in the future. which fits in perfectly with Boeing, because you could argue that Boeing is the most high-tech company in America in the late 1950s in terms of what they're doing with jet travel and military aviation and the B-52 and all these missiles and everything that were, the forefront of high technology in those days. And so that theme coalesces around the fair. It gets delayed a little bit because these things always take time, and it doesn't happen until 1962. And the Space Needle kind of fits in with that as well, the symbol of the fair that became the symbol of Seattle. Animators who created the Jetsons television series a few years later, there's documented proof that they were inspired by the look and feel of the Space Needle to create all those goofy kind of futuristic Jetsons homes in the Jetson cartoon series. And so the fair is all about the future. It's all about Century 21. That's the theme. And brilliantly, I mean, it's if you kind of look behind the curtain, it's almost like a giant version of those old West buildings where there's a big tall storefront that's rectilinear, but if you look behind it, there's a little peaked roof, kind of, so it's sort of like a fake storefront. They took a number of old buildings that dated to the 20s or the 40s in some cases and gussied them up, put new facades on them, but like 21st century looking modern, futuristic, mid-century modern facades on these old, ornate, classical buildings. And not exactly on the cheap, but in a very value-focused way, created this 72-acre fairgrounds in a place that was already kind of a civic destination that ended up being a perfect spot to hold the fair because it was just far enough away from downtown where the real estate was relatively cheap, but it was close enough in where it felt like you were in Seattle. You weren't going to some, like Flushing Meadows kind of thing, like with the New York Fair in the 1960s. The fair really transformed the city. It created this sense of civic can-do. I mean, it made money. It was profitable. 10 million people came through the turnstiles at a time when Seattle had about 500,000 people in their population. Ran for 6 months, from May to October of 1962. And it ends up being sort of almost like a last chapter before the really scary part of the Cold War. I mean, literally to the day. President Kennedy is there remotely on April 21st when the fair starts off. And in a nod to the past, he's at, I think, the Kennedy Florida White House, the Florida compound, and he's got the old gold-encrusted telegraph key that President Taft used to start the 1909 fair off. When they press the button, the fair would be officially started. So Kennedy does that by telephone, addresses the public, just audio-wise. And then 6 months later, he's supposed to come back. He's supposed to be here for the closing ceremonies on Sunday, October 21st. Everybody's excited, and then they get word on maybe the Thursday or Friday that, President has a cold. He's not going to be coming west. He's not going to go to Chicago. He's going to stay in D.C. and get over this illness that he has. And then the fair ends on October 21st. Very few people are around who remember that, but I remember talking to a nice old gal who worked at the fair. She said that night there was a big conga line. All the people who worked in the various foreign pavilions and the concession stands and everything. There was like this big celebration at the end of the fair. And the next day, Monday, October 22nd. It's like the official start of the Cuban Missile Crisis because Kennedy doesn't have a cold. He's just staying home to deal with the fact that American spy planes have detected Soviet missile bases being built in Cuba. And he goes on TV that night, less than 24 hours after the World's Fair has ended. Kennedy gets on TV and says, we've detected Soviet missile bases. I mean, they're imposing a quarantine. And it feels like, my dad, who at that point has, I think, let's see, how many kids are in the family at that point? Maybe 6 or 7 kids. He's over in Kirkland, east of Seattle, where I grew up. And he told me once, like, I'm looking at all these kids and like, what am I going to do? How am I going to protect them from nuclear war? There's nothing I can do about it. He felt utterly powerless and helpless. And as we know, of course, the nuclear war didn't happen, but it was a pretty scary couple weeks there where it seemed like we were on the precipice. So it was a very sobering way for that 6-month celebration of the future to get kind of a cold slap in the face with, the realities of human nature. It's like it's always it always kind of devolves to war. So, and then the 62 World's Fair was no exception.
So that, in some ways, I mean, you kind of set that up in that was the World's Fair in Seattle was sort of the end of the pre-Cold War, even though we were in the space race, which was kind of connected to the Cold War and kind of the hubris that went around that. And the fair was informed a lot by that future. And you talk about the theme being future in science. And at that time, I think a big part of science and future was space and the space race. Was the fair leading people's idea of the future? Was it responding to a general understanding of people's thoughts about the future? And if so, where are they getting that? TV's relatively new. We are listening to, Kennedy talk about going to we're not going to the moon yet, but, the space age is happening. So where are people getting these ideas, and how much of the fear was reflective of what people were already thinking about, and how much was leading where we might be going?
I think it's, it's a dialogue. I mean, the space program in the United States, I think Alan Shepard goes into space in May of 61, and the media, was all over that. And that was a big part of the conversation going on in this country about what the future was going to be about. And science fiction had been around long enough where the 1950s had all those movies that were sort of about the bad parts of technology, that people point to the atomic bombs being the reason that, all of a sudden we're Godzilla. The Godzilla story emerges from Japan, where it's about technology gone wrong. And, if the government through the Manhattan Project spends billions of dollars and creates this amazingly destructive weapon, and that's where science is taking us, in 1945. And so by the late 1950s, the Soviets, our great World War II allies, the Soviets aren't our allies anymore. We've been in this, Cold War for 10 or 15 years at this point. They've invaded Hungary. They've imposed, the Iron Curtain. They haven't built the wall around Berlin yet, but that's coming. They had the Berlin airlift. It's certainly a conflict, but the reality of being able to be destroyed by a missile, I think that's really clear in 1962. Because we've been watching on TV, Alan Shepard, John Glenn. And John Glenn comes to the fair. They have his capsule there on display. Big part of the interior display of the United States Science Pavilion is related to NASA and the space program. And astronauts come and are, celebrated for being there at the fair. So it's a big part of it. In terms of where it comes from and what people were expecting, I do think it is a dialogue. It'd be hard-pressed in 1962 to not be aware of all the stuff going on in the space race, and the U.S. promoting those, the Mercury 7, those celebrity astronauts that everybody knows, their household names. Kids could name, Gus Grissom and John Glenn and Alan Shepard and all, the different capsule names, Freedom 7, the Mercury 7 astronauts. They're the biggest celebrities of the day, and they're like the Beatles before the Beatles are the Beatles. It's sort of, the astronauts are the closest thing we have to those kinds of pop stars. We learn about their families. There's cover stories in magazines. There's stories on television that go deep into the personal histories, and so there's an effort to compete with the Soviet Union with our our own space program, and so that fits right into 1962. The other consumer technology stuff, I mean, so much great technology emerges from World War II in terms of improvements to things like automobiles and civilian aviation. And so we're already, even in the 1950s, we're already living in an age that feels kind of futuristic. And that whole mid-century modern architecture is accentuating and emphasizing this sort of sleek modern materials. There's melamine bowls and aluminum, stamped aluminum, stuff that wasn't really common before World War II. We're already saturated in that kind of material culture in the 1950s. So with capitalism, it's all about what the next new thing is, and that's why touch-tone phones make their debut at the Seattle World's Fair. You don't have to turn that big rotary dial anymore. Those consumer things are exciting, and they sound mundane now. And I don't know, I'm not a big video call fan. I still feel like talking to somebody. I don't need to see their face. President and company excluded, of course.
Appreciate that, yeah.
But also a big part of the fair, at its heart, it's still a carnival. I mean, there's carnival rides, and the critics of the fair, because there were critics here. Not everyone was on board having a fair in Seattle. The neighborhoods around those existing civic structures were wiped out, kind of, lower income neighborhoods that couldn't complain about anything, didn't really have the ability to put a stop to that land being demolished through eminent domain. And there were people who were just, every city always has people who just make fun of stuff, and they call it the Carnival on Mercer Street, which is where the main street that goes along the north end of the fairgrounds. But it overcame all that, and it made money, and you still, even here more than 60 years later, it's hard to look at anything that's happened since then and not see some kind of connection to the fair. So that the futuristic part for me, the most futuristic looking part of the fair, it's not the Space Needle, which is cool. It's not touch-tone phones. It's not the video calls. It's this notion of like, we're going to have this 6-month carnival, but then when it's over, we're going to have this incredible civic campus that's going to fit and serve this growing community that, it's still heart of the baby boom, a couple of years away from baby boom switching into Gen X. And it's so far-sighted because while parts of the fairgrounds, the Seattle Center, they call it now, still look kind of the same, like the Science Pavilion is now the Science Center, and the Space Needle, still there, of course. And the monorail, the goofy 1 mile long transportation device from downtown, the core pieces are still there, but many other places have been torn down and rebuilt, or the Washington State Pavilion, which is where they had the Bubbleator and the World of Tomorrow, where you went up this big plexiglass sphere and looked down through like on a domed city. That got remodeled and became a venue for our first major league team, the Seattle Supersonics, the base basketball team. But that was recently completely redone as a giant concert venue. They kept the original roof line, dug down deeper, and you go inside, and it's this incredible new facility for our new NHL team, and if we get an NBA team that comes back. So the core pieces are still there, but it's adapted and evolved, and that's really futuristic. I mean, if you can build something that's still standing 60 years later that can be renovated and remodeled in a way that makes it feel like it's brand new, yet retains this through line to the past, I don't know of any other way to think about the future in a way that's smart for a big city, because you can't just mow stuff down and build new stuff all the time. There has to be some sort of through line. In all the great cities have a through line. And Seattle doesn't necessarily have that in many other parts of the city, but they do at Seattle Center. I think that's crazy.
How do people in Seattle every day, either residents or visitors, how do they engage with the various elements of the fair that have remained on a day-to-day basis?
The monorail is kind of a curious one because they have invested a lot of money in it recently, and it's part of the transportation strategy for the NHL team, the Kraken, which has only been playing for about 4 years now. And so, it's because the monorail still connects the heart of downtown Seattle, what they call Westlake Center, Westlake Park, with Seattle Center. And it's the easiest way to get back and forth between those two spaces. And it feels kind of clunky. It's a mile-long route. It's over in like a minute. It goes like 60 miles an hour. And I've had guests from out of town who get on, and like we get at the downtown station and we go north. The ride's over in about 90 seconds. And they look around like, that's it? Because it's like the end of the line, which is, but it does its job, oddly enough, even though it feels kind of antiquated. The other spaces, some of the theaters that were built for the fair or remodeled for the fair are on the edge of the campus. And I would bet there's people who come to see the ballet or come to see theatrical performances who don't even think about they're going to Seattle Center. They're just like, they're going to the theater that's off Mercer Street, especially if they've moved here in the last 20 or 30 years. But like Climate Pledge Arena, that's what they now call the Seattle Center Coliseum, and what was originally the Washington State Pavilion, where that Bubbleator and World of Tomorrow exhibit was. That's the best example of a element of the fair that the shape is still there. The roof, this distinctive roof line with these big concrete trusses. The Beatles played there in 1964. The Supersonics played there starting in the late 60s. It was, hundreds of concerts, hundreds of important events have been held there where people have gathered for different reasons. And that's, the interior is totally different, totally gutted and rebuilt. But when you come walking up to it, it still feels to me like I felt going to see like Disney on Ice there, probably like 1972 when I was a little kid. The other space is this big fountain that was designed, the International Fountain. They've changed the guts and how the water sprays out of it, and they kind of rebuilt the mechanical parts of it. But the gathering space is still there, and there's photographs going back at least to the 1970s where that place was used for different impromptu public gatherings and ways of sort of public memorials. I was 12 years old, I think. When John Lennon died, they had a John Lennon memorial there. When Kurt Cobain died, I was there for that as well. After 9/11, there was big public gatherings. It's kind of this unique public space because Seattle doesn't have like a central park. If you go to downtown Seattle, other than the waterfront, there isn't sort of a big green area where you'd naturally gather near downtown. So Seattle Center has sort of functioned as this gathering space. And 63 years ago, it was pretty far north of downtown, like a mile. But now as the downtown has creeped northward, it feels like it's right in the middle of everything now. So I don't know. I'd love to be able to talk to some of those World's Fair guys, from 65 years ago. I don't think any of them imagined how successful the Seattle Center part, the after fair part, would be. I think they had a pretty good idea that it would do its job, but the fact that it's been evolved over time and continued to reinvent itself and continued to be relevant for sports and arts and public gatherings and science and, tourism with the Space Needle, I think is still the most visited attraction in the state. It's mind-blowing. You go there as a kid on field trips. Used to go to the carnival rides, which they got rid of most of the carnival rides. That's kind of a sad thing. That's a sore spot for me. The Fun Forest, aka the Gayway, is now long gone. But there's a big playground now in its place, which I guess is more healthy. Because it's like you're not getting spun around. You have to actually, and you get exercise doing it. So there's parts that I'm not happy with, but it's just it's undeniable that it's where most of the cool stuff happens in downtown Seattle. I mean, even KEXP, the kind of landmark radio station in terms of Seattle sound and being online, they chose to locate their studio and public gathering space there about a decade ago, which made perfect sense. It's just north of that Climate Pledge Arena in an old building that's called the Northwest Rooms, a simple tilt-up concrete with these kind of Northwest Salish Sea motifs stamped into the concrete. It was used for sort of generic displays and stuff, and KEXP made it their home, and it makes perfect sense.
If you were in charge of the next World's Fair coming to Seattle, would you put it in the same place, or would you develop a new neighborhood and create a new center?
No, I think you'd have to have it in the same place, but that would run the risk of it feeling very sentimental. I don't know. That's a good question. There's been a battle over where when we lost our NBA team about 17 years ago, when Howard Schultz sold it to a guy from Oklahoma who moved it to Oklahoma City, which didn't shock anyone other than maybe Howard Schultz. And in the interim, they've been trying to get a team to come back here, and there's investors bought land south of downtown. They wanted to build an arena kind of in the industrial area. And it's sort of, new stuff's always appealing, but with Seattle Center, the transportation infrastructure's there, the location's fabulous. I don't think we need to have a World's Fair anymore. I think Seattle, no thank you. I think we've World's Fairs, I believe, are for cities that are sort of trying to prove something, or trying to invite people to show them something that they might not have seen before. And maybe this is true now of every city, the way media has changed and the way access to information and images has changed. But, back in the 90s, there was a group that was trying to get the Olympics, some kind of a summer or winter Olympics in Seattle, because that was like the next big plum. We did a World's Fair. Still haven't had a Super Bowl here because they don't really do them in northern cities very much. But the big plum civically was a World's Fair. That would have been our next World's Fair, would have been hosting the Olympics. The city council, I think in 1998 or 99, just killed it. They said, no, we don't want to do this. It's a waste of money. We don't need it. We don't need to bring the world here. The world knows we exist. The world knows what Seattle is. We're very happy with that. And part of me feels like that's the day that Seattle started to die. That's a very harsh assessment of it. But I feel like once you stop striving for the next thing, that's kind of the old thinking. I think the more modern thinking is we don't need it because we can pick and choose. We don't have to go get an Olympics route.
I follow the World's Fair a little bit. I actually went to the World's Fair in Osaka, Japan this year. And I feel like it was a lot more like a Biennale type event where it's really focused about the country pavilions and different countries coming to, it could be anywhere. It wasn't really about the city it was in the way that the World's Fair in '62 or even Flushing Meadows and different World's Fairs in America in the last century were about, let's celebrate San Francisco or Chicago or wherever it was. I feel like it's less about the host city and more about the coming together of the world in different cities to share ideas and propaganda about their own country and kind of celebrate that. So I don't know if it's the same. I don't see, like, now the World's Fair doesn't leave a footprint in the way that it did, but I'm not a student of the World's Fair, and so I don't really. It's just a very novice observation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's almost like the idealism behind a fair like Seattle in '62, or even the one that I most recently went to was Vancouver in 1986. That sense that the world wasn't as connected as it could be, and that if we knew each other and had face-to-face relationships with each other, the world would be a better and a safer place. And I still believe that. It's just the current moment is so, it's kind of isolationist in the United States. And the idea of the United States inviting the world to come here is just like, I like the idea of that, but I don't feel like that's in keeping with the current times that we're in right now. It's who would want to come to the United States? I mean, we're seeing, severe drop-offs in the number of Canadians coming as tourists to Western Washington, and we depend on tourists from Canada visiting Western Washington. I've seen like it's down like 10-20% in some cases, and border crossings are down because of the current tariff, the trade war, and the political situation. So if things are all cyclical, I could see 10-20 years down the line, some new age where we are, in fact, reconnecting with the world and inviting our allies and our friends and sharing in this futuristic look, because there's still the intractable problems that were trying to be addressed in World's Fairs in 50, 60 years ago. We still have problems with housing and hunger and transportation and the environment. The theme in 1962 in Seattle was Century 21. 12 years later, when they had another fair in the state of Washington in Spokane, that was the first World's Fair to pick the environment as a theme. And a scholar recently told me that pretty much every fair since the theme's been about the environment in one way or another, because that's where the degradation is. That's, if we're really going to have a future, it's going to be about cleaning up the mess we've made and creating technology that doesn't make as big a mess going forward. But the momentum toward that all feels just feels like we're just kind of stuck in neutral right now, or going backwards in terms of that progress and that promise of the future, the very optimistic look toward the future being better than it was. And it's not just the political situation. There's many factors that go back decades with economics and housing and transportation that just haven't panned out the way we hoped they would, or the way that we imagined those problems would be solved. But we're not there yet. It seems like if you had a World's Fair now, it'd all be AI. It would all just be about nobody needs to do anything anymore. You sit there, the technology, technology creates the content and digests the content. You're just like you're just there making sure the power center is running, so it's got enough electricity to suck all the electricity it needs to create that stuff. So I'm in my late 50s, and I'm not pessimistic, but I'm sort of like scratching my head, like, wow, what are we going to do as we emerge from this? We're living in this history right now that is really hard to discern where we're headed. And I think about the past. I like the past because there's a beginning, middle, and end. Like the World War II stories of my parents have distinct beginnings in the 1930s and distinct endings in the 1940s, with all sorts of horrible stuff in between. But right now, I feel like we're right in the middle of something that nobody knows the ending of, or no one knows the final chapter or the final movement in this plot line. So it's hard to think a lot about the future, I guess, without feeling kind of like concerned.
That's kind of the conversation, where like, how do we think about the future, and how does the past inform the future, and how does changes today inform that? And I think, in the mid-century, post-World War II, the future was very optimistic for a lot of people. Not for everybody, certainly, but generally speaking, it was very optimistic. And I think we're in a place right now that has flipped, and there's alarmism and concern, and we know a lot more. And I wonder, we created a lot of problems coming out of the last century with technology and the way we designed cities and the way we designed how we exist, and we segregating people and all the things. A lot of them we didn't understand when we were doing that, we were creating these problems. Today, I think we do. Like in large part, we're still creating problems. We're still exacerbating problems, and we have a much more of a collective understanding of that.
I think about that a lot, actually, because I think what the future really is about, when it comes down to it, it's not about the technology. It's not about the speed with which you get from one place to another. And maybe this is at the family level, but I think it's true at the community level as well. It's about how you carry forward the values that you think are worth carrying forward for the next generation. Whether you have kids or you don't have kids, you want the values that we've believed in as Americans or as human beings, or some combination of that for my whole lifetime. And at the family level, it's sort of you hear stories, like you hear stories about Grandpa did this, or my dad would tell stories about when he was escaping and everything. You sort of get the sense like, okay, honesty is important, and hard work, and all these things that sort of. And when you think about where you live, there are things that we love about our place where we live, like the environment, the clean water, the architecture, the schools. You want those things to carry forward. You don't want anything to deteriorate. But we get so bogged down in these political disputes about granular stuff that I rarely find any elected officials speaking to the bigger future. And even not having a World's Fair, but just like, how do we make sure that 100 years from now, you can still get from one place to another in town, that there will still be housing, that there will still be, clean water, that there'll still be a way, that there'll still be things that make our community distinctive from, Atlanta or from, San Luis Obispo. I mean, because there's this great homogenization through capitalism, which is great because you can get the same hamburger in every town in the world. But if communities can't distinguish themselves, then it feels like the meaning kind of drains away. That's where I struggle with the future, because when there's big national or international forces that are anathema to what I think are the values I want to carry forward, and I think about the struggle of civic leaders in cities or counties, and even in states like West Coast states, the blue states. And I just think, like, how do we persevere when so much of this is beyond our control, given the current climate? And how do you find manifestations of that? And a lot of that is history. It's architecture, and it's street layouts, and it's the neighborhoods that we live in. It's not about the Space Needle. It's not about, the Climate Pledge Arena or whatever. It's about how we live every day. Maybe that's the one of the fringe benefits of AI, which has really driven this conversation about what technology means and why use technology, or how much technology should we be using, like whether we're having it write things for us or whatever. Maybe there'll be some turn back toward that stuff, that really important community stuff everyone says they like, but I don't see a lot of investment in time or resources in making communities stronger. So that's kind of a all over the map kind of answer to what you're saying. But I feel like we're in this struggle right now to define what the future even means, let alone what it's going to be like.
And for who? Yeah, I think that, one of the things that I think is really important about the work you are doing as a historian and a communicator is, when you look at societies that have collapsed or empires that have fallen, a big thread you can point to is collective amnesia. And I think to the degree that we can continue to understand our past and understand our history, that informs how we move into the future in so many ways. And I think we are really susceptible to forgetting what happened last week, let alone last century, and how important that is for us in designing and, as you mentioned, strengthening our communities and strengthening our cities. So I think continuing to tell the story of what happened is important for creating the story about what will happen.
Yeah, and nobody wants to be lectured. I like that story about the summit they held in Alaska a couple months ago, where Putin was lecturing President Trump on like ancient Russian history. I kind of like I've seen Putin do that in speeches before, where he gets into this I'm sure it's interesting, but nobody wants to be lectured like by some sort of like tyrant about why we're doing that. We have to do this now because this and this and this. And we have so many great storytelling tools available to us now. Not to get super dark, but just like a week ago, I was at Auschwitz a week ago, my first visit ever to my father's native Poland. That tour, my daughter was with me, and the tour felt like we were jurors being shown all the exhibits for a trial. There was no attempt to, and I mean this in a good way, there was no attempt to sort of tell a narrative or to focus on one particular individual as a way of like telling a specific story to tell the general story. We were just led through areas and told what happened here and numbers and things. And it was really effective. It's like, okay. And I told the tour guide was this Polish woman, probably in her 60s or 70s. And I said, I feel like we're jurors, and you're showing us all the exhibits, and this is part of a trial that we have to be witness to. And so I was grateful to it, but it's like, it's kind of a self-selected group who goes there. If we aren't talking about our values all the time, and again, not to be not boorish history lectures like Putin, but just a way to kind of illuminate everything we do with like, how does this align with our values, and is what we're doing, is it what's it about? Why are we doing this, and how does this relate to the past? Very few people have patience for that. The beat I did for 10 years at this local commercial radio station, I was a reporter focused on history, but I got to be subjective. And I always said, like, I cover local history like I'm a sports reporter covering the home team, and I want history to win. So I would get in the face of public officials if they were, if there was a building that they were choosing to not designate a landmark, or because this is way off, not sort of off topic, but it's at Seattle Center, the old Memorial Stadium built in 1947 to honor war dead from Seattle Public Schools. They decided they wanted to replace that. Even though the stadium was dedicated, they wanted to rip it down and build a whole new stadium. Even though the one built in 47 was like, that's the hallowed one. That's the one the families sat in the stands and they dedicated it. But because the civic establishment deemed that it was in the way of this new stadium they wanted to build, it wasn't considered a landmark, which is ludicrous. So I got to do a lot of this kind of like, in people's faces about stuff. And it was often very inconvenient for me to bring up like, well, what about this? And like, so I got not a reputation as a crackpot, but I was kind of an irritant in a good way. And from my perspective of like trying to make sure history was always part of the conversation. And some people like that. Some people don't, or I drone on too long. Imagine that.
So let me ask you about kind of bringing history into the conversation, and kind of, this is a big question, but what does Seattle 1962 in the World's Fair tell us? What do we learn about cities today, about how to build cities, how to build community, how to build the future? What do we learn from that moment?
I think it's partly about timing, that Sputnik launch and that money being available to kind of give it a shot in the arm. But specifically in Seattle, what it meant was that if there was collective agreement about what they wanted to accomplish, which there was, they could pull off something that was nobody thought they could do, and it would train this sort of phalanx of civic engineers, guys who then would go on to do stuff to tackle some of these other problems, whether it was pollution or there's this thing called forward thrust that came out in 1965. A bunch of biggest, at its time, the biggest ballot measure in terms of total dollars, tax dollars raised anywhere in the States, to fund a whole bunch of specific things like acquiring public land, building swimming pools, building public parks. There was a transportation component for a rail system that was rejected multiple times. That's one of the biggest mistakes Seattle ever made in some people's mind. I kind of see it kind of half and half, but it gave a boost to what was possible, because Seattle it was kind of a middling sized city. It was always a kind of a punchline or a character, like an off-screen character in a lot of TV shows and things. Like the film would move to Seattle. It was never really first and foremost, but it showed that a medium-sized. You didn't have to be New York. You didn't have to be Los Angeles. You could be a medium-sized city and specialize, like as we did in Boeing in those days. And you could find a place to fit into this greater economy, both manufacturing and marketing and sales, but also culturally too. I think that gave Seattle the confidence that emerges decade after decade with the film community, with the literary community, with the music in the 1990s and everything. It kind of gave us a confidence that we wouldn't have to be a version of New York. And when the settlers first arrived here in 1851, this Denny party, they're credited with being the guys who came from the Midwest, led by this 29-year-old Arthur Denny, a surveyor. They weren't coming here to farm. They weren't coming here to, raise sheep or cattle. They wanted to build a city on Puget Sound, and they did that brilliantly, beyond anyone's wildest dreams. That notion, when they had the settlement, they called it New York. This is in 1851. This is like the New York of the West Coast. And some wise guy appended this Chinook jargon word, alki, which is now pronounced alki. But anyway, it meant eventually, kind of a wise guy, like New York, yeah, someday. It was sort of this like wah wah. But that all kind of goes away after the World's Fair. It's like, it's not New York eventually. It's Seattle. We're not the new whatever or the next version of this. We're our own thing. We kind of found our own way to do it because we're thousands of miles away from the East Coast. We're just we don't have all the resources that other cities have, but we're going to do it on our own and pull it off. And that that's true in the 1850s, true in the 1960s. Don't know if it's true now. It's different now. It's a different world. The challenges are different. And I think when I worked at the Chamber of Commerce in the 1990s, it was all about, we're going to be this world-class city. We have Microsoft here, Nintendo. We're going to be huge. Seattle's going to be very popular. And it all came true. But some of the stuff along the way, like housing and transportation, didn't quite keep up. And now we're struggling with that gap between this big world-class city with world-class ambitions and huge technology companies here, but we don't quite have the back end to support all that stuff in a way that makes it possible to live here in a way that, people of all incomes can survive. We have big city, world city problems now, but I'm confident we can tackle them because we have this history we can look. Our current mayor always talks about Space Needle ideas and this notion of like one Seattle. And they use the Space Needle as a metaphor for thinking big. I haven't seen it really kind of pay off yet. And I don't know if it's clear what a big Space Needle idea is, but I think the potential is there to use the past, not as something to club over the head with about like, we should be doing this, but as inspiration, because, the future is unwritten as we sit here right now, but as long as we carry through those values that I was talking about, there's a through line, which is good for everybody.
I love it. Feliks, thank you so much for talking to me. I really appreciate it. And we'll look for the big Space Needle ideas or the grunge ideas or whatever comes out of it.
Yeah, exactly. Alky, eventually.
Alky ideas. All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks, Chip. Bye-bye.